So, lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming. I'm going to start this talk with a very short guided practice, the kind of thing that would come into a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course or a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. It happens to be very similar in nature to the one that is a shortened practice which has been produced for this book, which is really for mindfulness based on the sort of cognitive behavioural approach, the scientific approach for anybody, for people having just stressful lives. It's called Mindfulness: A Practical Guide to Finding Peace in a Frantic World. So it's along the lines of the practices that are in that book. So it take 5 minutes. It's also, I find it very nice to do something like sit in silence with a group of people before I start to talk. It makes me feel much better about it. I don't know about you, but there we go. So, here we go. So now bringing attention to the body, noticing the weight of the body and the pressure of the body on places that touch the ground, the feet, perhaps in the thighs, the knees, wherever the body is touching the ground, noticing the pressure, the sensations of pressure there, on the seat, noticing the way we're sitting. Noticing the sensations that are in the feet. Perhaps the differences in sensations in parts of the feet that are not touching the ground. What sensations are there? Moving attention to the lower legs. Resting our attention there for a few moments. What sensations that are there? Moving the focus of attention again to the knees. What is there? The upper legs, the muscles resting on the thighs, perhaps touching the ground. Moving attention into the pelvis area, the hips. Noticing the way the pelvis supports the spine and the weight of the internal organs. Bringing attention to the belly. Noticing the way it moves with the breath. What sensations go with that movement? Moving attention to the lower back. Muscles holding the back in place. What sensations are there? Moving attention up the back to the upper back, the shoulder blades. How are they resting there? Is there movement there? Breathing in and breathing out. Coming to the ribs. Is there movement there, rising and falling, breathing in and breathing out? Now on an out-breath, letting go of that focus of attention on the chest and the upper back, bringing the eye of awareness to the hands, the way they're resting on our knees, in the lap, the sensation of touch. Noticing the sensations in the palm of the hand. Perhaps the difference in sensations between the palm, the fingers, the fingertips, the skin stretched over the back of the hand. Moving that awareness into the lower arms. What sensations are there? Moving the eye of awareness to the elbows, the upper arms, the way they're resting, the way they're hanging from the shoulders. What sensations are in the armpits, the collarbone, the neck, the throat. The sockets of the jaw, resting there. The jaw itself, the lower lip, moving attention to the cheekbones, the upper lip, resting on the teeth. To the tip of the nose, up, moving attention up the nose, to the bridge of the nose, to the eyeballs, resting in their sockets. The forehead, what is there? Moving attention to the sides of the forehead, to the sides of the head. The ears, the back of the head. The scalp, the crown of the head. Now narrowing down the attention to the breath itself, finding a place in the breath where sensations seem vivid, perhaps breathing in and breathing out, the way the breath moves into the nostrils, the nasal cavities, watching the sensations change with the in-breath and the out-breath. Perhaps noticing the way the belly rises and falls, breathing in and breathing out. Sensations of stretching as the breath, breathing in as the belly fills, the way the belly sinks on the out-breath. Or perhaps the way the upper chest and the ribs move, breathing in and breathing out. Wherever you wish to rest your attention on the breath, focusing attention there for a few moments, for a few breaths. Noticing thoughts coming in to awareness, perhaps our awareness following them for a moment, and bringing that awareness back to the breath, noticing where our awareness has wandered to as we bring it back to the breath itself. Now, relaxing that focus of attention on the breath, broadening a sense of awareness around the breath, perhaps with a rising and falling as the breath breathes through the body, breathing in and breathing out, as if the breath were moving into all parts of the body, each breath, breathing in and breathing out. Awareness are riding on this breath through the body. Embodied breath in this moment and the next, in this breath and the next. Spacious, embodied breath. Well, thank you for indulging me. I feel much better. I was talking to my son this morning and saying, what can I do? How can I start this? I need a nice story. I've used them all up. I've said them all before. And he said, well, okay, how about this one? So he was in Australia a couple of years ago, working on a gap year, working in the mines as it happened, but he was at the time spending some time on the coast in Western Australia. And his travelling companion was a very keen surfer, and she'd get up in the morning, really dedicated at her surfing. And he thought she was a little bit intense about stuff, and he lent her one of Chogyam Trungpa's books that he had with him, which was, I think it was, what's the one? Counteracting Spiritual Materialism, yeah. And anyway, she went off surfing in the morning and came back really unhappy because she'd lost her keys to the car, and they were the only keys she had for the car. So she went and locked herself away in a room and started reading Chogyam Trungpa's book. After a while, Robin knocked on the door and said, you're not going to find your keys in the book. And persuaded her to come down the beach just really to have a walk and maybe have a look, see if she could find anything. If it wasn't there, it wasn't there, but there was no way she was going to find them reading the book. Anyway, so they went down the beach and they looked around and basically began to get used to the idea that the keys were lost, and bringing back a sense of the pleasure of just being on the beach, really. And just as they were about to leave to go back home, Robin looked down on the ground where his friend was standing, and there in the sand were the keys poking through. So it's a nice little illustration of bringing a broader awareness into our experience can actually produce all sorts of unexpected things. Anyway, I'm going to ask you a question because it's quite a difficult one. Lots of people have tried to answer it, but I'd be very interested to hear if anyone would like to have a go. I don't want to put anyone off, but does anyone have a good idea or good definition or a good description of what mindfulness might be?
Moment by moment moment awareness. Moment by moment awareness.
Moment by moment awareness, that's a good one. Anyway, without judgment, yeah. That's a good one too. Moment by moment awareness without judgment, yeah.
Kabat-Zinn's living life as if it really mattered.
Living life as if it really mattered. I think that's another lovely definition or description, perhaps.
Antivirus software for the brain.
Antivirus software for the brain, yeah. Or for certain types of brains, anyway. Okay. Well, they're really good definitions. I guess as part of talking about where all of this came from, read a couple of paragraphs from Bhante Henepula Gunaratana, and someone who probably knows how to pronounce that far better than I do is welcome to give it a shot. But for the time being, that'll do. Anyway, this is supposed to be a really good book on straightforward mindfulness. It's called Mindfulness in Plain English, from the Pali tradition. So someone, a practitioner from the Pali tradition, talking about a key practice from their tradition. And he says, mindfulness is the English translation of the Pali word sati. Sati is an activity. What exactly is that? There can be no precise answer, at least not in words. Words are devised by the symbolic level of the mind, and they describe those realities with which symbolic thinking deals. Mindfulness is pre-symbolic. It is not shackled to logic. Nevertheless, mindfulness can be experienced rather easily, and it can be described as long as you keep in mind that the words are only fingers pointing at the moon. They are not the moon itself. The actual experience lies beyond the words and above the symbols. Mindfulness could be described in completely different terms than will be used here, and each description could still be correct. Mindfulness is a subtle process that you are using at this very moment. The fact that this process lies above and beyond words does not make it unreal. Quite the reverse. Mindfulness is the reality that gives rise to words. The words that follow are simply pale shadows of reality. So it is important to understand that everything that follows here is an analogy. It is not going to make perfect sense. It will always remain beyond verbal logic. But you can experience it. The meditation technique called vipassana, or insight, that was introduced by the Buddha about 25 centuries ago, is a set of mental activities specifically aimed at experiencing a state of uninterrupted mindfulness. So that's the business that I'm involved with, and hopefully a lot of other people are interested in as well and are also involved with. I'd like to ask you another question here, but perhaps we could leave it to the end of the talk to have a go answering. And it's really why. What is mindfulness for? I'm talking about the use of mindfulness in the title of the talk, which is how it can impact on human potential in all sorts of areas of life. But first of all, I want to say a little bit about what mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is as part of a story about what mindfulness is and the kind of mindfulness that I'm involved with. As Marie mentioned, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy was developed by three clinical psychologists researching into treatment for recurrent depression around 15 years ago, one of whom is my boss and professor at Oxford University in the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, Professor Mark Williams. His other colleagues were John Teasdale, who happens to be a Buddhist and teaches at Gaia House, and Zindel Siegel, who also happens to be from Jewish tradition. Mark Williams is a Christian. So we had 3 people here from different spiritual traditions involved with clinical psychology, coming to a conclusion on the basis of cognitive behavioral science that learning not to think too much might be a useful thing to do. And so they went and looked for a meditation training that could be used, and because Jon Kabat-Zinn had devised an 8-week course, had been used and was familiar, people were familiar with that in a medical context. He'd been using it for, at the time, 20 years in Massachusetts to help people manage chronic pain and general stress. But they rooted mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in cognitive behaviorism, whereas mindfulness-based stress reduction was rooted in the Buddhist psychology, primarily of the Pali Buddhist origins, which is behind Bhante Gunaratana's practice. So the actual practices of insight meditation that were taught by Jon Kabat-Zinn to Mark Williams, Zindel Siegel, and John Teasdale for the purposes of developing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy are the same. They're insight meditation practices. It's just that there is a slightly different set of theoretical background for them. One comes from science, which is looking at third-person, generally observable measures, and the other is the report of meditators, in the first instance Siddhartha Gautama, of his experiences and how he explained this in a language called Pali 2,500 years ago. So just different social contexts with different languages, with different methodologies. There's a great deal of overlap, not surprisingly, in what is in the Pali material and what is explained in cognitive behavioral models of the way in which suffering arises. So really, since this work on recurrent depression, there's been an explosion of interest in mindfulness in all sorts of areas. I mean, there were no more than half a dozen or so pilot trials, small-scale trials, before the major trial in mindfulness to look at mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for recurrent depression, which led to the publication of the results and the publication of the book Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy for Depression in 2002. These trials cost around 5 million quid to run, so it wasn't surprising that there hadn't been many of them run before that time. A couple of weeks ago, just as an example to explain the explosion of interest in the scientific community that has followed that, really in the last decade, I did a search on the US National Register of Clinical Trials using the search term mindfulness. Anyone can do this, it's on the internet. And 140 clinical trials came up that were listed. It's being looked at in applications in almost all sorts of areas, for every kind of area you can think of in psychological well-being, psychological health, mental health conditions. It's being looked at in how the physiological interactions, but physiological measures are being looked at in connection to psychological health and well-being in a wide range of trials. So I'm going to talk a little bit about here now an introduction to the kinds of ideas that are coming in from a cognitive behaviorist viewpoint. We're coming from a biological background. A nice way of describing this would be the behaviorist approach, which developed before cognitive behaviorism, is to use an example of gazelles grazing. They're all in a family group. They're at ease. They're feeding. The blood is going to their guts. There's a degree of alertness. they're looking out for predators, but the body is involved in grazing activity and digestion. One of them may notice, a predatory threat they may notice a predatory threat. A cheetah might come along and chase them. All of a sudden, the blood moves from the abdomen, from the viscera to the muscles. Blood patterns in the brain change. Eyesight becomes, it becomes really important for them to focus attention on how to avoid the predator and how to avoid obstacles, to move as quickly as possible. So there's a real clear shift between a sort of normal resting state to a highly active stress state, that with adrenaline and all of the processes that are involved with running away and perceiving a threat. Now, on occasions, the cheetah manages to catch one of these, bring one of these gazelles down, and the immediate threat to the other gazelles is over. The cheetah has got its dinner. And these gazelles can't hang around too long before worrying about the fact that they've had a really frightening experience, because they've got to spend their lives, as much time as possible, eating grass and digesting it. That's their life. Their daily lives have got to be focused around doing that for all the daylight hours that they have. And within a few minutes, perhaps 10 minutes, their physiology begins to go back to a grazing, digesting mode. They've forgotten about the fact that their friend or the other gazelle is now the cheetah's dinner. They're getting on with life now. Behavior in animals is based around the natural a process of conditioning. They might end up recognizing over time that when they pass a particular clump of trees in a bit of a valley or whatever, this is where cheetahs hide, and they begin to get the idea that this is not a good place to come. Habits begin to form, and they'll perhaps be a bit more careful in this area, or perhaps avoid it. But clearly what happens with us is that we've got this much more complicated imagination process that's focused around language, and we begin to build much more complicated ideas about who we are, how we can do things, how things happen to us, and this narrative process then informs the conditioning processes. And the trouble is, this narrative process sometimes doesn't work very well. Sometimes when we get too engaged in this narrative process, we actually lose touch with our everyday experience, our moment-to-moment experience. It can end up causing us stress where we don't need it. What's happening here is what's called an attentional blindness. We can become concentrated on something and become distracted from a wider awareness. And stress can be wrapped up with this attentional blindness in the same way that the gazelle is really focusing its attention on the object that it's got to run away from, which is the cheetah. We can easily get wrapped up in attentional blindness that comes from us being focused on our thoughts in the same way, and it can result in the same way in the way the cheetah is involved with running away from the cheetah, being involved with imagining imaginary cheetahs in our lives, and we're actually embodying that physiological state even though there's no cheetah there. And so we can end up causing stress where we don't need it, where our bodies aren't really going to get the opportunity to run away from the cheetah that we're imagining. This is really beautifully described or studied in an experiment which you may well have seen on telly. I can't remember what's that sort of magician on telly I've seen him do this. Anyway, a researcher goes up and asks someone on campus how to they start thinking, oh right, okay, they create an imaginary map of where they've got to go. This, okay, you go down this way and you turn right and so on, and then as this person is describing how to get to where the researcher has asked them to go to, the two other researchers come by carrying a door, and one of the last guy carrying the door swaps over with the researcher asking the questions, and then continues, that researcher that was carrying the door continues asking the questions, and the researcher that was asking the question takes the door, so he goes off walking with the door. And half the people being asked the question of where do I go, or how do I get to wherever I want to go, who are answering that question, don't notice that the person has changed. Their focus of attention has been so closely engaged in thinking about how to get from A to B that their awareness of the actual change of the person asking the question has been shut down completely. And that's the kind of thing that can happen with getting too wrapped up in our thoughts. So another experiment that is used to describe what's going on here, and describes a really important model that I'd like to use, describing two modes, which are very similar to the kind of modes I've been talking about with the fight or flight mode of the gazelles, and the sort of normal resting state, feeding state mode. We can talk about them in terms of an approach mode and an avoidance mode. Two different physiological states, two different psychological states that come with these two modes. This is really interestingly studied in a little experiment that's called the mouse in the maze experiment, where you get a group of people, subjects to your experiment, and you ask them to do a maze where there's a mouse and he needs to get to the hole. So that they've got to trace the maze, a way through the maze to get to the hole. One group of the subjects have got a little picture of an owl on the piece of paper flying above the maze. So psychologically they're aware of the fact that the mouse is trying to get away from the owl to get into the hole. The other group of subjects have got exactly the same maze, but they've got a piece of cheese by the hole, and they've got to find a way for the mouse to get to the cheese. And if you ask these people after they've done that experiment to think of uses for a brick, I think the statistics are something like that those that have done the mouse in the maze experiment with the cheese compared to those that have done the mouse in the maze experiment with the owl can think of twice as many uses for a brick, and far more interesting and creative uses for a brick than those that have been done the test with an owl. So very, very subtle cues can really change our ability to use creative potential or think around a subject. Just those subtle cues can have that much impact. Now, if we come back to gazelles again, think about the social aspect. Gazelles have got some kind of social group, social interaction going in a herd. They're probably dominant members of that herd, younger members of the herd, etc. But human beings are a little bit more complicated in their social processes than gazelles. What the approach mode is related to is having a sense of ease. And as social beings, we're very much, that sense of ease is very much something that's related to being at ease socially. One of the problems that we face is that so much of the time we don't feel at ease socially. We feel that we've got to achieve certain things. We've got to use our problem-solving skills in order to pay the mortgage, in order to gain some kind of status in our workplace, so that and we focus our attention on those activities. Some people in society aren't very good at using those skills, and they feel not so good about it. This is part of the reason why there's, I think, an explosion in depression in society, because people very few people in our society actually have a need for food or shelter, but they don't feel good about themselves for some social reason, and that social reason is more to do with inequity in enormous access to resources, or relatively less access to resources, and how that reflects upon a self-image. But being at ease is something that we naturally want to find. It's something that gives us a more open awareness, an awareness that enables us to come up with more creative solutions. It's something that we can share in a team. The other day I think I bought the News of the World. It's the first and last time, unfortunately. But I think it was in there that Paul Scholes was talking about why England did so badly. And he was saying that unlike team players from Manchester United, not that I'm a Man U supporter. My friend over here in red it comes from Liverpool, so he was saying, well, these people from other teams, they want to show how good they are. They've been picked from other teams as individual players of excellence, but they come to play in England and they're not team players. They want to be able to show how good they are. And yet there are plenty of very, very skillful footballers in this country, but yet we always fail, we always underachieve. And compared to the Spanish footballers, which we're beginning to realise play a team game, they're much more, they're engaged in a sense of self that's around a team. It's sharing the activity within a team rather than focusing on any particular individual. And there's a social function there. There's another really interesting study that was done not so long ago, where a small group of psychotherapists in training went through a short meditation training, and another group, they compared this with another group of psychotherapists that didn't put through this meditation training. And then they measured the outcomes of clients, altogether around 130 clients. And what's remarkable is that the outcomes of the client outcomes measured of the clients that, of the psychotherapists in training that done the meditation training was better than the outcomes of the clients of the psychotherapists in training that hadn't done the mindfulness training. It's very interesting to wonder what might be going on there. I think part of this story is the way that we pick up behaviour from, well, a lot of this story is about the way we pick up and model behaviour for each other, and how that's infectious. Everyone knows that if you smile at someone, they're going to feel better. If you stub your toe, if someone stubs your toe, you're going to go, ouch. Something is going on socially that we read inside ourselves, we experience inside ourselves, that's going on for other people around us. And in this manner, psychotherapists in training had learned to be more present with their own their own embodiment, and less involved in thinking about what's going on for their clients. That had a positive impact on the outcomes of the clients. There's some kind of mutual modelling process that's going on there that the clients were picking up subtly from the psychotherapists. Part of the explanation may come from what had been described as mirror neurons, and these were the term was coined when activity in the brain of macaque monkeys watching another macaque monkey, or even a researcher carrying out some kind of task were seen to be triggered in the macaque monkey watching another macaque monkey doing something. So same areas of the brain were being triggered by watching another monkey doing something that was going on in that monkey's brain. And there's some kind of suppression of the expression of those movements in the body, but there's some kind of imaginary process or cognitive process that's going on just watching that other monkey that's being mirrored in the neuronal processes. So it's just a sort of neurological explanation of the way we hold our bodies, the way we move, the way we sound, can have a subtle impact on the way somebody next to us can feel. So perhaps this has got something to do with the way Spanish football teams are much better at playing football as a team than our football teams, because our football teams are thinking too much about, our footballers are thinking too much about winning or doing well themselves, rather than being a little bit more relaxed and perhaps being more engaged in the present moment with their own experience and how that's impacted by their relationship with their team players. So this is just a little example of perhaps how mindfulness can, on the one hand, I've explained or given some reasons to believe that mindfulness can help us find keys where we've lost them, help us be more creative, and potentially work in a way in which teams can be more effective. And in this case, an example, a suggestion that that's something behind the success of successful football teams.